Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome here at the Linguistic Forum conference and at the Institute of Linguistics Professor Juha Janhunen from the University of Helsinki. He's a world-famous specialist on Uralic and Mongolic languages, and he is as I said, professor in East Asian Studies at the University of Helsinki. He has started as a historical comparative linguist, in particular in Uralic languages. Like everyone working with Uralic or specifically Samoyedic knows his Samoyedische Wortschatz, a collection of etymologies of Samoyedic languages. And then he left on, started doing not only historical linguistics but also descriptive studies of Mongolic languages. He's an author of several books on Mongolic languages and on Manjura and Evenki, so it's kind of grammatical description work, but and also beyond historical linguistics, grammatical descriptions. Juha is interested in the history of linguistics. And he's currently the leader of the project Manuscripta Castraniana, who aims to annotating and publishing manuscripts of this of the famous Matias Castrana, Helsinki-based researcher of the 19th century who traveled a lot along the Asian parts of Russia, and was the author of the first grammars of several, of a dozen of languages. And finally, Juha is also interested not only in pure linguistics, but also in like ethnic history, ethnic rights, and endangered languages. And that's exactly what he's going to talk about today. So I'm really glad to give the floor to him.
Я, наверное, буду говорить по-английски, но я должен сказать, что у меня будут критические замечания по поводу английского в этом докладе. И вначале я думаю, что можно новое сказать, и вообще очень мало можно новое сказать об этой теме, поэтому я буду говорить и старые. Вот доклад будет иметь такие составы, компонентные составы, и I will turn to English, so I will say a few words about my background. I think the linguist who most impressed me was Robert Austerlitz. As you may know, he worked on Niuch, but he was also fluent in many languages, including Finnish. So I met him first in 1972 when he gave a lecture on Niuch, or Gilyak language, in Helsinki. But later, if we think of this problem of endangered languages, then I have been in touch with Michael Klaus and Stephen Worm, and also Lyle Campbell in different projects. And a Japanese friend of mine, Hiroshi Soji, also collaborated with me on this project. So I started my work on the languages of the Russian North as a student in the Herzen Institute in Leningrad. And here we are visiting this institute with some of my colleagues, some of whom are still alive, including Professor Maria Yakovlevna Barmich, who is still teaching Ninets at Herzen Institute. And in the course of years I have met people who have different attitudes to the problem of language death. So Stephen Worm was very optimistic in general, so he always said that we have to be bilingual or multilingual and everything can be arranged. Also, although in some respects he had also doubts about the survival of languages. Evgeny Khilimsky, I photoed him in the synagogue of Moscow about 30 years ago, and he was a language pessimist because he thought that small peoples will not be able to keep their languages. And I think he may have been right. I never knew personally Peter Ladefoged, but he's known as a person who was a language nihilist. He said that English will be the language of the world, and we shouldn't care about any other languages, because he thought that people have the right to choose whether they change language or not. But then Michael Kraus is more realistic, I think. He has been one of the first who, on the international level, started talking about language death. He was leader of the Alaskan Languages Documentation and Survival Project, and I met him already early in the 1980s. The status of the Alaskan languages is not good. As you see, there is only one language that seems to be surviving. It's Siberian Yupik on the island of St. Lawrence. I don't know if this figure is true, but it looks like, and it's well known that these people tend to keep their language, but all the other Alaska languages are more or less dying. And I made a similar statistics about the languages of the Soviet Union in a conference in 1990. And although some people have criticized me for using Soviet statistics, I still think that this statistics is pretty good and it corresponds to the truth. So we see that the languages that had the lowest rate of speaker population are now almost dead. So the number 26 here, Oroch, is already dead in 2006. And Chuba never existed, but Itelmen, Niv, Aleo, Turegi, Negidal, they are all spoken by just a few people. So 30 years ago, there were still about 100 or more speakers for these languages. But basically, these statistics reflects the true situation of the late Soviet period. And the latest statistics, I think, are much less reliable. I mentioned here the book by Alpatov, which is about the language policies of the Soviet Union. But I think these issues were not much discussed in the Soviet period. So one of the first conferences on northern minority languages with a focus on Siberia was organized by Hiroshi Shoji in Osaka in 1996. And the results were published as a book. Then there was also this UNESCO project on the Atlas of World Languages in Danger, where I contributed the section on Northeast Asia. These are points where I have been observing language situation on the spot. So it's basically southern and eastern Siberia, Manchuria, but also northern Tibet, and recently the Amur region and Sakhalin, the Russian Far East. I'm just showing this because I will now show a few pictures of my own work over the years. So I worked with the Nenets speakers. This is a picture of about 40 years ago, and there are some speakers whom Tapani also knows. There's Irina is here on the right, and she's at least still active as a teacher of Nenets. This lady was the last speaker of Evenki in the village of Subo, which I visited with Professor Asardin about 30 years ago in the Barbuzin area east of Baikal. And more than 40 years ago, I visited with Professor Ikegami in Japan, the last speakers of Wilpa or Orok in Japan. As you may know, these people were evacuated from southern Sakhalin to Hokkaido after the war, while another part of the Wilta-speaking population remained on the Soviet side and is now still surviving on Sakhalin. But here we have to the left, Ikegami's main informant by the name Napka, and he lived many years after this, but the others died rather soon after this picture. Then also in the late 1980s I visited the Orochen in China, and they had very few speakers of their language, and the language is now almost dying. But my favorite small people were the Hamnikan, who are bilingual and who speak a Mongolic language as the community language, and two kinds of Evenki at home as home languages. And when I was there last time, about 25 years ago, they were still very vigorous as a speech community. But recent information is that they are losing their Mongolic community language in favor of standard Mongolian. But there's no information as to how well they preserve their Evenki languages. Then this is a group of Solon. The Solon, as you know, are also kind of Evenki speakers, but these are from the basin of the river Nonni in central Manchuria, and their dialect has not yet been studied. I've been trying to find young people who would go there and do fieldwork among these last speakers of Nonni Solon. I've had several candidates, but for various reasons they have not done the work. So I wonder who is willing to go there, as long as the people still speak their language. Then from the Tibetan region we have this Bonan, Mongolic languages, Bonan, which is very well preserved as a village language in 4 villages in the Rekong region of Qinghai province. So everybody in the village speaks the language. And the same is true of the Muslim Bonan. So this language was divided between 2 religious communities, and they were geographically separated in the 1860s. But they speak basically the same language with a different cultural background. So they look very different, and their cultural vocabulary is different. And the number of speakers is some thousands for both types of Bonan. But they are still living languages, as is also Santa or Dongxiang, which is the largest Mongolic language after Mongolian proper. So very few people think of Santa as a Mongolic language, and they themselves have no idea of that they speak a Mongolic language. But there are about 500,000 people who very consistently keep their language. And that's one reason is that they cannot read or write, many of them, and if they do it only in Chinese. Then we have Mangur, another very vigorous group in Qinghai province in China, speaking a Mongolic language. And recently we have been doing field excursions also with students to the Nivch. And as you may know, there are actually 2 types of Nivch. There are Nivch, mainly in the Amur Basin, and Nivch on Sakhalin Island. So Katja will actually tell more about their language situation, but it's not very good. And last summer, I was for the first time able to see the Ulcha speakers, some of the very last speakers. So this is a typical picture. There is one Aboriginal, представитель коренной народности и 5 anthropologists, 5 anthropologists. So it's a typical picture for these small peoples, that you have more people studying them than the people themselves. This is an advertisement for the new journal. It's being published by Brill. The first volume will be out in May. And me and Alexander Vovin from Paris are the editors. And we welcome papers on Inner Asian or Central Eurasian languages. especially papers which have a broad scope, like typological, diachronic, taxonomic, and which consider not only one single variety, but also other varieties in areal or typological perspective. And we accept papers in English, French, and German, but unfortunately not in Russian. So these are the languages. And now I have a section where I deal with some problems which I think are problems for small languages, why they don't survive. I will have to go quite soon. So I think the first problem is the international order, which is based on nation-state, on a nation-state model. And as you know, there are only 200 states, but 7,000 languages. So most languages don't have a state. And even those 200 states have mainly only about 100 national languages, because many of them use the same national language, which very often is English. And internationally, only much fewer languages are used. At the UN, we have 6 official languages. So it means simply that almost all languages of the world have no state structure behind them, and this is a big problem for their survival. We also have to think of what is indigenous or Korенные. We normally understand that it's a group of people who don't have a state structure, a non-national, stateless, or fourth world group. They speak languages which are not official. There is also some United Nations definition that it should be a group which has been living in the territory at least for 150 years, so some kind of criterion for aboriginality or indigenoushood. But we have to accept the fact that also national languages can be indigenous. So in many areas, these major languages are also indigenous in some parts of their territory. But I still think that it was better before World War I, when the world was divided in empires. So we had only very few states and many more languages than we have today, and especially many more languages that were still being transmitted to children. So personally, I support the imperial model of state structure rather than the nation state, which is the worst option for languages. And there are some natural empires like Russia and China in the world. There are also some colonial empires, and there are some post-colonial countries which function as empires like Indonesia and India. But mostly the world is composed of post-colonial nation states, and after World War II, all countries are conceived of as nation states, and this is a big problem in Russia, even bigger in China, because China is now being conceived of as the nation state of the Han Chinese, and all the other languages, at least 300, are not considered as national. So everybody thinks that a person coming from China is Chinese and speaks Chinese. It's closely connected with the problem of globalization. We are losing the local aspect of cultures and languages, and also the rural aspect. It's partly due to population growth and population movements, and it leads into increased uniformity in all aspects of life, including languages. And one of the languages that are really dangerous is English. So you see how it's spreading even to Russia and China in the form of soft power influence. But we also have to think that languages are inherently unequal. So some languages have simply better resources. There is literature, And there are simply more speakers, they have a higher status in administration, they are used as international languages, so it's impossible to think that all languages could become equal. That's why we have to think that those languages that we want to survive should reach a certain level, but they cannot reach all the levels or all the domains that more important or major languages have. And there is also a lot of differences in the degree of diversity. So Russia has maybe 100 to 150 languages, China has more, India and Indonesia have even more, and some rather small countries like Cameroon and Papua have as you know very well, have a very large number of languages. While then there are a few nation states like Korea which have only 1 or 2 languages. Korea now has 2 languages, although the government does not recognize the other language, which is the Jeju language spoken on Jeju Island. But then we have the problem of killer languages like English, Chinese, so very much in the world now happens in these killer languages, and people go and adopt these languages because they think it's good for their personal progress. So here is the German proverb, das einen Tod ist des anderen Brot, which you may know. So languages struggle and they eat each other's territories, and the winners are the killer languages. So we have here a map of the English-speaking countries. It's almost like McDonald's, and many of these languages, many of these countries don't have actually native English speakers, but they have adopted English as a national language, which I think is a problem. The same problem we have with the internet. So internet is dominated by English. But some languages, actually Finnish is not on the list, on this list, but Finnish is actually one of the, I think, 25 most used internet languages, which is a rather good position. So languages can struggle for their survival also on the internet. In China, the position of languages is weakened by the ethnic policy, which divides the population in 55 nationalities plus the Chinese. So when China was formed as a republic in 1912, they had a different policy. They had this 5 nations policy, which recognized the large ethnic groups, Mongols, Tibetans, Manchu, and Muslims or Uyghurs as major groups, and that was a better system because it recognized the hierarchy, and the hierarchy normally supports linguistic diversity. So when you have some buffer zone between the big language and the very small languages, but the current system, in the current system, so Tibetans, for instance, who still have about 5 million speakers in China, they are at the same level as the speakers of Lopa, with just a few thousand people speaking. So no basic difference, and I think this is conscious policy. Also, educational systems support the dominance of so-called big languages. Many countries have gone over to educating people in a foreign language. People often criticize China for introducing Chinese as the school language in Tibet, but in neighboring Bhutan, in the same way, English is the only language used at schools. So not in no way better solution. And English is actually increasingly much used at schools. This is a famous quotation from Kofi Annan, who thinks that literacy is a bridge from misery to hope, and it's a vehicle for promotion of cultural and national identity. This is actually not true, because if people become literate, they normally also want to go ahead, and they very often ultimately change their language. One way to literacy is boarding schools, and we know that boarding schools have been very detrimental to the languages of the north in Siberia. This is a Hamnigan boarding school. And when I was there, this was not a bad boarding school because everybody spoke the same language, although they were brought from rather distant parts of the steppe area. But in most boarding schools, speakers of many different languages are brought together, and then they speak the national language, like in Russia, Russian. And I think bilingualism is also a problem. This was mentioned by Evgeny Khilimsky often, that bilingualism is not necessarily good. It's good for the individual development. It's even good for your brain development to know several languages, but it's not necessarily good for the survival of small languages. And especially, it's of not much use if you know two major languages. I just mentioned that Cameroon has about 250 languages, but they have only two official languages, English and French. And the school systems work in these two languages. And the goal of Cameroon is to reach bilingualism, so that everyone is bilingual, but bilingual in English and French, not in the 250 other languages. I think multilingualism is good for the elite. This is a Finnish priest from St. Petersburg who proposed that an educated person should know at least these 8 languages, and I think that's good. But for speakers of small languages, it's for the survival of the languages, we should somehow see to their possibility of keeping their own language alive. And another problem is this standardization, normalization. So in the Soviet Union, it was very popular to normalize and standardize all the small languages for which they created literary languages. And this was often a problem because people speaking other dialects than the norm did not like that norm, and they rather used Russian than. I think what people would need would be a simple way to write their languages now, because they can use it on telephones and in internet, but they should not be engaged in norm creation for languages which will never get domains that require really norms. So the Soviet Union ended up with symbolic use, and it created an illusion, this policy, that the languages are alive, although they were actually dying. Nobody spoke them, but the schools were full of books in those languages, and it created the illusion. In some cases it was good, like this is a Nesang or Forest Nenets textbook, so children can learn the traditional terms. But this doesn't mean that they learn to speak the language. They just learn some terms and concepts. But I don't think this is the way to teach the language. And one problem for small languages is, of course, that the speakers are often culturally specialized. So there are some monoprofessional languages spoken by reindeer herders or fishermen, like the Nenets on this picture. And somehow they should either diversify their profile of speakers, or they should keep to the traditional culture. And Khilimsky proposed or wrote that it's probably the option for some of the smallest language groups to retain their cultural specific features, like reindeer herding, and in those areas the languages can survive. But there are other possibilities if you are sufficiently ambitious, like the Northern Sami in Scandinavia. So they have successfully diversified their speaker profiles. So there are Sami teachers, medical doctors, or truck drivers, they are not only herdsmen anymore, and that's why they have also got some political influence. But this requires a lot of activism and some good luck. So then we have this problem of political correctness, which is a problem in almost everything we do nowadays. And the big problem is that indigenous languages are often confused with immigrant languages. I think with immigrants, the policy should be to try to integrate them into the environment to which they are moving. But at the same time, we should try to keep the identity of the indigenous groups and languages alive. And this is not often understood, so administrative structures often don't make this difference. We have here a picture of the multilingual composition of Helsinki metropolitan area. So there are about 158 languages spoken in this area, but only one of them is indigenous, and it's Swedish. It's not Finnish. So the Finns also came to this town, but just a bit earlier than the other immigrants. And the current policies do not really support the indigenous language. But in Finland we also have the Sami, 3 Sami languages, whose speakers are now in the same situation as the speakers of Arabic or Somali, who are much more numerous than the Sami speakers. Then we have also what we can call language suicide. This was the original topic we were proposing for this conference. So we have long talked about language death and even killer languages, language killing, but there is also a phenomenon we might term language suicide. There are some languages which have lost their chance even from very good positions, like Irish and Manchu. And now I think many African languages are doing the same mistakes. So they are not developing their own identity, but they are accepting the colonial languages. I'm somewhat familiar with the Manchu case. I think the Manchu, it's well known what they did wrong. They expanded too rapidly to a too large area. They left the homeland in Manchuria and they opened up the homeland to Chinese settlement as late as about 1870. So it was because they were afraid of Russia. But was it a better option to open it to Chinese settlement? And then they created this banner system which integrated not only Manchu speakers but also Mongol speakers, Korean speakers and Chinese speakers into the same military system. So ultimately the Manchu lost their language. And here you see the map of Africa, the business languages of Africa. So there is no single African language on this map. It's only French, English, Spanish, Portuguese or Arabic, which are used in Africa as business languages. So of course this language death phenomenon has been active in the past. A good example is Anatolia, which is now almost perfectly Turkish speaking, but we know that about 500 years ago nobody spoke Turkish in Anatolia, everyone spoke Greek. But before Greek there were many other languages, so we can identify about 20 ancient languages. And this is only because we have written evidence on those languages, but we can imagine that the situation is the same everywhere in the world, even when we don't have written evidence. Okay, so yeah, so these are the types of endangerment. So we can speak of horizontal endangerment. So many languages are losing their status in some areas, but if they still keep it in some other areas, they are better off than languages which have this vertical endangerment, which means that the young generations all over the language territory are no longer learning it. And there is also what I call taxonomic endangerment, that language families lose their members and become less diversified. So this is the number of languages in Greater Siberia, which includes parts of Manchuria and Mongolia. And we have more than 70 languages historically which we know from this area, but about 19 of them are now extinct, and almost 30 are moribund, so they have only a few speakers. Only 2 languages I would classify as safe for the moment. Yakut and Tuva may be safe languages for the moment. So there's no immediate danger to their disappearing, and maybe one language, Buryat, is viable. So it's losing its ground, but it has still several speakers, large numbers of speakers, and including children. But most other languages are doomed to disappear, and there is not much to do for this. But I calculated what I call the survival index of language families. So just classifying the members of a language family in 5 categories: safe, viable, endangered, moribund, and extinct. And then you see how many languages are in each category. And then you give 4 points for being safe, 3 for viable, endangered, 2 moribund, 1, and extinct 0 points. Counting this for Tungusic, we get a survival index of 0.23. It's difficult to explain it in detail now, but we can compare the indexes we get for different language families. Mongolic has a better survival index. It has 0.48. There is only one recently extinct Mongolic language. It's the Mogol language of Afghanistan. For Turkic, it's even better. So Turkic languages are, for some reason, very vigorous. But there are some extinct Turkic languages, also like Soyot in Siberia. For Uralic, we have quite many extinct languages and several moribund languages. So the index is not as high as for Turkic. For Kamchukotic, Kamchatka and Chukotka, it's lower. And for the Yeniseic family, it's very low because there is only one moribund language surviving of this family, while the other 4 historical members are now extinct. So very soon the whole language family will disappear. So this is a statement from Stephen A. Worm. So he was positive about the future. There is hope that certain amount of languages can still be saved, perhaps even more than we have anticipated. And there are some things that are required if you want to save languages. To some extent you need money, but much more importantly you need activism. So there have to be some active people. And we have a good case in Finland. We have Inarisami, which has been revived from a status when it no longer was transmitted to children. And this was only because there was one active person initiating this movement. But I think it's also necessary to have diversification of the cultural base. So you cannot survive only as reindeer herders or fishermen. In some cases, religion can support the preservation of languages. I think this is among the Muslim populations speaking Mongolic languages in China. But there is also this hierarchy aspect. I mentioned the Solon case. I think the Solon in general keep their language rather well, and it's because they have several other languages separating them from Chinese. The Solon, all of Solon speak also Dagur, a Mongolic language, and many of them also speak regular Mongolian. Earlier they used to speak Manchu, and Chinese comes only then, while the Orochen, who are losing their language, also speaking an evinke-related language, they have no hierarchy. They have only Orochen and Chinese, so they are simply turning to Chinese and losing their own language. In some cases, isolation certainly protects languages, like we see on St. Lawrence Island. The Siberian Eskimo language is surviving in this geographical isolation. But we have some groups, some successful groups. We have a group of Tatar in Finland, in Helsinki. They came about 120 to 100 years ago, and they are now about 800 people. But surprisingly, they have been able to keep their cultural identity and also the language, so that even small children still speak the language. And this is only because their own activism. So they have never asked money from the government. They have been engaged in business and become sufficiently self-supporting that they are now able to, and for over the decades they have been able to keep language schools and summer camps for children where the language is kept. Of course, they are losing some speakers in every generation. They are very much worried of this, and they are also trying to get Tatars from Russia, from Tatarstan to Finland. But this variety is already quite different from the Tatar that is spoken, the Tatar language spoken in Kazan. It's originally a dialect of Misher Tatar, spoken in Finland. But it's an example of a diaspora group which has been able to keep. At the same time, they are very much integrated with the Finnish society. So they're very loyal to the Finnish government, and they fought in all the wars on the Finnish side. And so it's a very exemplary group. We have another very bad example, the Ainu in Japan. They have lost their language in spite of huge resources that have been wasted on them. So there are so many Ainu museums, Ainu research institutes, Ainu societies, but they have never been successful to revive the language. Very typically, the Japanese government recognized the Ainu in 2008, about the same time as the last speaker was dead. There are some semi-speakers still alive, but it's can be said to be a dead language, and it will be fully musealized in 2020 when the Japanese government will open a large new Ainu museum in Nibutani to commemorate the Olympic Games in Japan. But it's an example of that money doesn't help you if there is no wish and no proper organization. I think, and I have said this many times, that to help languages survive, we have to choose those languages that we think have a chance to survive. So in Siberia, apart from Yakut and Tuva, I think it's mainly Tundanenets that really has a chance to survive. So we should put a lot of energy to support Tundanenets. While the languages that are obviously moribund, unless there is a local activist, they have no real hope. We will soon have an election in Finland. This was an election advertisement. So think global, act local, but I think it also applies to languages. We should think global but speak local. It's very important that languages have a local base. They should have a locality where they are spoken, and that's why people coming to a locality should adopt the language of that locality. So it's the basic rule of immigration. While in Western societies now, the political correctness dictates us to not to integrate immigrants too much, but to let them have their own languages and cultures, and in this way, ultimately, even large groups like Finns and Swedes will lose their languages. So thank you, this was all I had to say.
Thank you so much. Now it's time for questions, and maybe questions can be both in Russian and English, right?
Thank you very much. Your talk was so universal and also clearly presented that it's difficult to even to think of a question, but I still have one question concerning what you said at the very end about the cruel choice. In principle, I think it's realistic, but on the other hand, you mentioned this case, some miracles like the Umiraющие case, and maybe some other places on Earth can be given a chance to do the same experiment. Maybe a few more languages will provide then your cruel choice suggestion applies. What do you think?
Yeah, you are right. So we originally had a paper on the parallelism between medical states and language states, and languages can be healed if there is a cure, medicine, and but there is also this possibility of miracle healing. So some languages can be miraculously healed, but we cannot count on this option if there is no sign of healing. So if we have a language where there is an activist or a couple of activists who really work actively to support and revitalize the language, then I think we should really help them. But many small languages do not show any sign of activism. The speakers are extremely passive, and if you ask them, they probably say that, well, it's a pity that our language disappears, but it's better for us not to speak it anymore. So if you are in such a situation, I think it's hopeless to waste resources.
Building on what you said about resources, kind of continuing this conversation, does it mean, because there are two types of work that linguists in this situation can do, just simple documentation, with trying to document as much as possible with all the clarity and details, and something that can be called efforts on whatever, revitalization, maintenance. What kind of resources, because your resources are always, they have borders, you don't have all resources. And sometimes this is a problem for individual linguists who really have to share their attention on one type of work or another type of work. It's a moral choice, it's a cognitive choice. I mean, what is your opinion about the resources in this case?
Yeah, so I think I said that I think it's a waste of resources if you write ABC books or textbooks or normalize the orthography or even teach the language at schools, because we know that the way, for instance, the languages are taught in Russia, it's 1 hour of optional learning at a time which is very unsuitable for most school children, so nobody takes that language, and it's also normally directed only at the so-called ethnic members, while I think that language should be supported locally. So if you have a community where you have some indigenous people and some Russians living, I think everybody should learn the local language, and it should not be optionally 1 hour, but it should be at least 5 hours a week every day for everybody. So that's one possibility to use resources, but it's, otherwise I think what really we should need would be to teach children, small children, speaking the language. For this we require kindergartens, and in Russia, for instance, the kindergarten administration system is rather complicated. They require certain qualifications, so they should loosen these rules and allow groups to gather with a leader of a speaker of a language. But of course this leader should have some kind of payment. So I think the money needed is not very much, but this is one possible use of money, to have speaker groups. but then they should be attractive enough for the children of all ethnic groups in that locality. And to keep them attractive, maybe you have to use some resources to offer the children and their parents. Then of course you can also use some resources for the education of the parent generation, who normally are a bit unsure whether it's good or bad to learn the local language, which they themselves no longer know. So this kind of money is required, but it's not really very big money, so that you need maybe more change of attitudes and change of some rules.
I'm not sure if I understand your idea about imperialism correctly, but I'm not sure how imperialism can get any better at preserving the indigenous languages that nationalism did. Because, for example, if you look at Latin American countries now, it can't really say that Spanish and Portuguese empires did any better than the nationalist governments do now at preserving the indigenous languages. So I don't quite see how you can describe imperialism as developed as compared to nationalism now.
Yeah, well, you have good and bad examples, but at least the languages survived under Spanish and Portuguese rule. But now we have a lot of nation states, each of which propagates, except Paraguay, the use of a colonial language. But there are good examples, like the Russian Empire and the Chinese Empire. So I'm always saying that two of the best examples of autonomy are Russia and China. And with this I mean Finland under Russia, when Finland had the total rights of using their own language and culture and even administration. And under China today we have Hong Kong. And under Finland today we have the Åland Islands, which have a perfect linguistic autonomy. But in general, in these empires we had this hierarchical structure. So we had one imperial language, and then we had some regional languages, like in the Chinese Empire, Mongolian and Tibetan and Uyghur function as regional languages. And the speakers of smaller languages, they normally access the world through the regional language, and then only perhaps with the imperial language. So there was a buffer zone between the big language and the small languages. And in this way, nation states are very single-mindedly supporting their own national language. This idea, so one state, one nation, one language. But there was no such idea in, for instance, in imperial China. So they never propagated a one language policy.
Поскольку мы выступаем за языковое разнообразие, я считаю, будет правильно задать вопрос по-русски. Сейчас идет активное развитие систем машинного перевода, и действительно результаты уже неплохие. С вашей точки зрения, вот эти результаты достигнутые, которые будут улучшаться, они скорее будут способствовать языковому разнообразию или скорее наоборот?
Я думаю, наоборот, потому что я уже видел примеры, когда люди используют эти машинный перевод для того, чтобы они могли читать тексты на языках, которых они не знают. И в любом случае эти машинные переводы развиты только для больших языков, для крупных языков. Это невозможно думать, что мы получим аналогичные программы для каких-то языков, у которых может быть 5 носителей. Они требуют очень большие ресурсы, чтобы создать такие программы. Я думаю, что они будут работать между большими языками, как английский, испанский, французский, русский. И пока они еще не очень хорошо работают.
Я тоже по-русски задаю вопрос, поскольку это Игорь Маланди, и я преподаю, я имею летние курсы для русского языка уже 9 лет. И у нас именно это направление, что мы поддерживаем язык старых людей, который передает этот язык молодому поколению, который совсем не умеет. И уже 3 года у нас действительно появились молодежь, дети. Мы говорим дети от 7 до 27 лет, допустим, это дети все-таки. И теперь действительно вот год этого, как это коренных народов, да? И мы вдруг не имеем, в этом году мы для курсов 10-й год мы не получили нигде деньги. Вот откуда, как делать, чтобы это уже как началось уже 9 лет, с Финляндии в основном получили. Откуда спросить, чтобы это продолжать, это лето? Люди уже привыкли, дети уже двигаются, дети уже появились. Как делать это? Вы говорили, что деньги не кончились, как-то как-то кончились.
Да, то есть тут нужны не очень большие деньги, но нужны...
Нет, 2000 евро где-то.
Да, я понимаю.
Нет,
так
но
что,
для меня большие, чтобы сама делать это.
Да, ну это примерно то, что нужны какие-то деньги, это, хотя маленькие. И проблема, если деньги кончаются.
Спасибо. Я хочу вернуться к тому вопросу, который был подан как то, что для сохранения языков полезной и иерархическая структура и вообще империи, а не национальное государство. Это действительно, ну, ощущение, что это действительно так, но исчезновение империи совпало с появлением телевидения и радио. И есть ощущение, что это на самом деле гораздо важнее. А вопрос такой, есть ли какие-то примеры иерархической структуры языков
да, я понимаю.
Сейчас и которые бы лучше способствовали?
Да, я понимаю, что радио и телевидение – это пример глобализации.
Ну, так.
А империи – это старая система, но до nation states. И, конечно, радио тоже можно использовать. Например, Инари Самы, про который я говорил, у них есть радиопрограмма на своем языке. И очень важно модернизировать культуру. Инари Самов есть тоже эти рэп, певец рэп. Это очень важно для молодежи привлекать их к языку. Так что также эти телефоны, я считаю, что можно использовать для развития языка, если не слишком нормализировать, разрешать писать на языке, как люди сами пишут. Можно помогать немножко создать какую-то основу для письменности, но не надо создавать большую мировую литературу. Даже не надо перевести Чехова или Пушкина на северные языки. Главное, чтобы они сами писали маленькие сообщения друг другу.
У меня такой вопрос. Есть ли какой-нибудь порог числа носителей, ниже которого вот невозможно успешное восстановление языка, знаете ли? И второй мой вопрос. Почему вы не включили в ваш список потенциально выживаемых языков коми? Очень активно.
Да. Нет, коми, я не включил тут европейских языков вообще. Это в основном сибирские языки только. Да, они, да, восточные коми, да, я знаю, да. Да, коми это, конечно, хороший пример. Там же очень много носителей все-таки. Я не знаю, 200 тысяч или 300 тысяч, так что. А что вы сперва спросили?
Знаете ли вы какой-нибудь порог?
Да. Вот эстонский президент Лennart Meri сказал, что Эстонию спасали в последний момент после советской оккупации. То есть эстонский язык не мог бы выжить в условиях Советского Союза надолго после того времени, как она снова освободилась. Но пример Инарисамского показывает, что 200 человек достаточно. Когда они живут локально и занимаются в достаточной мере локальной культурой, то я думаю, что специальной границы нет. И очень большие языки, как ирландский и маньчжурский, на маньчжурском говорило в XIX веке больше 1 миллиона человек, а сейчас говорит, может быть, 2-3 человека. Кроме группы Сибо там в Туркестане, и среди них тоже всего очень мало носителей.
Насчет эстонского я бы хотела добавить, что в мире есть 0,6% языков, которые говорят больше 1 миллиона. И эстонский язык очень большой язык.
Да, эстонский это достаточно большой.
0,6%
Да.
с мировых языков, где носители языка более 1 миллиона. Так что, наверное, такая угроза у нас есть.
У нас есть время для одного последнего небольшого вопроса. Have time just for one small question. Maybe I can ask. I wanted to ask you about the Chukchi language when you list the languages for survival. Do you think that language?
I have not very much, and I have never been to the Chukchi area, so, but I know some Chukchi language specialists. So, as far as I know, there are still children learning Chukchi in some regions. So, if there are children, there is always hope. But there is at least a horizontal endangerment in some regions. Chukchi is no longer spoken. But on the other hand, they are rather much focused on their traditional professions. So there is a chance. But Chukchi is in this. It was also in my list from 1991 that it was a language with a fairly good chance of survival. But I cannot say more.